Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Cove Podcast. I'm Captain Todd Lemper, your regular host, and today we continue on our series of episodes about joining Special Operations Command, referred to as SOCOM, about what it takes to become a member of the Special Forces and how to best prepare for the journey should we wish to take our career to the next level. Whether you're in the ADF or you're thinking about joining through the ADF careers pathway, you're bound to get some helpful information and advice and tips straight from the source. SOCOM is secretive by design, and today we get to peer behind the curtains and get an insight, which is incredibly rare, into the SOCOM world. For our third episode of the series, I'm joined by Major Ange Uphill, a PhD, an Army physiotherapist who was part of the Army Human Performance Optimisation Cell within SOCOM that conducted a comprehensive research project to assess the physical and performance impact of selection on candidates. Welcome, ma'am.
Thanks very much, Todd.
She was right there observing them and collecting data to determine the indicators for who was more or less likely to make it through to the end. I think what we do is come back a little bit. Obviously, the intro is done now. Amazing. You're described as a superstar throughout, and that's why we got you on the podcast.
Thanks.
And I know we spoke pre-episode that you were hesitant to do the podcast, but I'm so thankful that you did. I suppose we start back with your association with SOCOM in its initial sense. Obviously, we talked about a physiotherapist. We'll definitely talk about your PhD because that's what it's based on selection, but also what all your good work was. But I suppose I want you to start back before SOCOM. What got you involved in SOCOM, serving in SOCOM, and then subsequently wanting to research selection?
Yeah, sure. So I've been in physio in Army for 22 years now, and throughout my time was really lucky to have an opportunity to deploy with the Special Operations Task Group a couple of times to Afghanistan, and that, I guess, started my passion for working in SOCOM and eventually saw me posted to SASR as their unit physio for quite a number of years. So I started over there in 2010 and then was there on and off for years after that. And fast forward to 2019, and I got a call from some of the guys in the Human Performance Cell at SASR asking me to come and do some research for them. And it was clear to me that the research needed to start with selection because having been a physio working with those personnel for a long time, I'd heard so many stories that started with ever since my selection course, blah, 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 hasn't been the same. So it was obvious to me that selection was this huge insult on these soldiers, and as it's the common method of entry for soldiers wishing to serve in SOCOMAND, I just thought we needed to find out what was the size of the impact of that course on the personnel and, were they recovering or how long is recovery actually taking so that we could inform, what needed to happen during the recovery process or during their reinforcement cycle training after that.
Yeah, so I suppose we talked, and if you haven't listened to the first two episodes, go back, but we had OCF Selection Wing on talking about the common selection, and then we had the PTIs from the Human Performance Wing talking about physical preparation. This is an extension of that, but it will be far greater than what that episode gave. But I suppose they talked about it doesn't stop at selection. All the way through reinforcement training cycle, we still need to maintain the rage to get through, and it's incredibly demanding. I suppose is that first component, and I suppose breaking yourself in selection or carrying injuries through has a far larger impact throughout reinforcement training cycle. Is that the broad argument that you would make? Yeah,
100%. I mean, the reinforcement cycle training, lots of those courses are really hard and they are relentless. There's back-to-back training for a long time. So if the soldiers are coming into that process with an injury, then there's some of their attention and their energy and their cognitive capacity is busy recovering an injury. It's much harder to learn and harder for them to then be successful, and also hard to recover from an injury in that cycle because there's no time to stop. So, ideally we want people getting into that without injury.
Obviously, you start your research on a certain trajectory, and so you picked selection, and I suppose we should go into your research now, but you started on a certain trajectory. Did it change throughout, or was the thing you wanted to measure at the start, what was your thesis or lack of a better term, and where did you end up at the end of your study?
It definitely evolved. What I thought we were going to find wasn't necessarily what we found. I guess I didn't know at the outset of my research what were the things that were going to become most important, and the things that we could, I guess, go after for people to improve on to have a better experience throughout selection and following selection. And so much of what I measured was a new experience for me too, and it was a learning experience, and for all of those around me. So yeah, definitely, I think everybody that has done a PhD will tell you that what you set out to do or where you start is not where you thought you were going to finish is not necessarily where you finish, and the most important things that come out of it and not what you anticipated.
So obviously, your study talk about its SASR selection. So in a number of years, what were the years you sort of did the study over?
So the data collection was primarily focused in 2021 on the SSR selection course, but there was need to do a little bit of extra data collection in 2022 and again in 2023. And that year was the first, iteration of a common selection because they started to incorporate integrators in 2023. Obviously, it's changed a bit into 2024 and beyond with the new common selection, but I would argue that the findings that we have from this data collection and the lessons that come out of it are equally relevant for the selection as it stands now, because it's still a hard course. There's still food deprivation, there's still sleep deprivation, there's still heavy loads. The impacts on the person are the same, despite the units now being, the course being selecting for multiple units.
Yeah, and I suppose I say selection, when you did talk to that, it remains just as rigorous and just as challenging and one of the most gruelling courses in the world, I suppose.
Definitely, yeah.
So that's where it started, going through SASR. Obviously it's relevant to the common selection now as well, but I suppose where did you start collecting? So what did you collect initially and then where did it end up?
Okay, so yeah, we collected a number of things. So I wanted to understand what was the energy cost of selection, so how much energy or how many calories per day were the soldiers burning, to understand, to kind of quantify how hard is selection from an energy perspective. So energy out, we were measuring energy in, so all of the food intake, whether they were eating fresh food or rations, we were measuring how much were they eating so that we could understand how big the deficit was throughout all the phases of the course. We also measured bloods, so looking at hormones, testosterone, cortisol, among others, but they're the main ones, I guess, that people can really understand and relate to. I was measuring metabolic rate to understand what did the course do to people's resting metabolic rate, and physical performance, so strength and power. And body composition. I missed, it's one of the biggest. But we measured body composition. So I looked at height, weight, muscle mass, fat mass or body fat percentage, and bone density, pre-course, post-course, and all of those things I measured following the course, immediately following the course, and then 1 week, 3 weeks, 5 weeks, and 8 weeks post-course to understand their recovery following selection. And then for the post-course measures were only for those who were successful, because obviously for everybody else it was very hard.
To the units.
They've gone back to the units all over Australia. It's just we couldn't do that. But for those soldiers who were then on the reinforcement cycle, I actually tracked them for 18 months following the course.
So obviously that's a massive change in the hormones side of the house. I suppose why does that happen? And follow on, and I'll probably, if we go down a rabbit hole, ask you again, man. But what can we do about it?
Yeah, good question. So some of the things that cause those sort of big changes that we saw in the hormones and body composition and even the performance changes, there's a number of stresses that are involved that can cause those changes. And so we're talking about high physical stress, so big energy outputs and high rates of exercise and strength and all the works. Psychological stresses, cognitive stresses, sleep deprivation, and food deprivation. So basically all of the things that selection involves. You put those together in a big, all together the way that selection does, and the changes we saw were quite expected.
Yeah, so, and I suppose the follow-on is what can you do about that, or what control do you have over that?
Yeah, so I think for most candidates on selection, pretty much none. You cannot control. Obviously, selection is hard and it has to be. There's a good reason for that. But I guess when I was looking at all of those, the size of the changes or the consequences for the candidates of selection, and looking at what could be done, is there any way we could minimise any of it? The only thing that I could, see is that in some cases people could reduce the energy deficit by trying to eat more of the food that's given, not leaving things behind. And the reason I would say that that's important is because if we can reduce the damage that is done to the people who finish that course, then they can recover faster, and they're more ready for the training that follows.
Yeah, more so you talked about like that week of recovery following, I suppose, and then they're straight into reinforcement training cycle. Like, yeah, the ability for them to continue training throughout that entire time and get to the end is probably enhanced by being able to consume as many calories as they can throughout the entire selection.
Yeah, that's right. And if they are just a little bit less beaten up when they get to the end of the course, then they're less likely to be getting injuries, during selection, but also in that period soon after selection, but also less vulnerable to things like coughs and colds and, getting ill as well.
Was it every individual candidate that was on selection, or did you use a sample of the population?
So I recruited from everybody, but obviously could only do data collection for those who consented. But we had a really high uptake actually, which was really fortunate for me. Yeah, so I think the 2021 there was about a little bit over 100 candidates on the course, and 93 of them signed up to be part of the study. So and then when you added together those candidates and those from 2023, which I got some of the data from, there's over 200 people worth of data from at least pre-course, yeah.
I know this is going to seem like I'm leaping back, but I did an episode with Dr. Jack Watling, who's a academic as well at RUSI. But we talked about access to data, but also how well received you are by the people or your sample and population. But was it significantly easier to get involved because of the fact that you'd already worked with the unit and you had an awesome rapport? Would you get the same access to that data if that were not the case?
It was critical. Yeah, the fact that I had a relationship with the unit, had worked there before, was a trusted insider, was key for me being able to even attempt to do this kind of research there. So that was getting around, a lot of communication with the staff to be able to talk about why was this important, what would they get out of it, and how could we do it with minimal disruption to the course. So that was that side of it, getting permission to do it. And then there was the I guess, recruitment part of it. So to get the candidates interested, because they're already, they've got so much on their mind. They're going into selection. They've done all of this preparation. They are focused on what they're about to do. And it is so hard. I am always so impressed by every person that turns up to the start line of selection, let alone is there at the finish line. So I knew I was asking a lot from those people to be part of this, but we were able to, I guess, explain why we were doing it, what was important. Lots of people like the idea of getting a DEXA scan of themselves and seeing what their muscle mass is and their body fat, and so they got access to all their own data. So I guess that was a selling point. But yeah, I'm still very appreciative of everybody that said yes.
If the idea is that a lot of people reattempt, I mean, they've got a plethora of data to be able to reattempt with and fix things. We'll get into the fixing things component because you've got one individual story that's absolutely awesome. But so we talked about the why you did the research or why you set out on this journey, and then what you collected. I suppose the most important thing is what were your observations and findings. This is going to take somewhat, and I imagine we'll discuss this for some majority of the episode. But what were your findings?
Yeah. Okay. So I guess I'll try and go by this systematically. Yeah. So first of all, the energy cost of selection was enormous. So to kind of put it in perspective, I guess. There's research out there that says that the average male civilian in this kind of age range, 18 to 30-ish, would be burning around about 3,300 calories per day. That's kind of about normal. When we look at military members, it's, if we go across all different trades, we're talking in the 4,000 calories, area. We saw for selection the first phase, so the first 10 days-ish, that they were burning around 7,500 calories each per day, which is just phenomenal. It's, it's Tour de France kind of level of energy output, but without Tour de France level energy input, so phenomenal energy output. Excuse me. During the next two phases, a little bit lower, but still very, very high, up in the 6,000s. So it's one of, from looking across the research of different militaries, different courses, it is one of the highest energy output courses in the world. So it's hard.
I suppose just to link it back as well to the common selection now, we talked about Special Forces medics, Special Forces signallers and Special Forces engineers doing that first module. So they are in the same...
They're doing the hard bit.
Still in that same sort of calorie deficit for the entire duration of that first module.
Yeah.
Still going to be incredibly difficult.
Yes. Yep, it's just long duration. It's long hours of high output and high load carriage, causing that. Yep.
And the deficit lasts for the entire duration of selection.
So that's the energy output. The energy input, when we looked at it, so the deficit in that first phase was, they're not being deliberately starved there, but what we saw was they were eating about half as much as they were burning. So they were already in about a 50% calorie deficit, even though at times they were eating 3 or 4 meals a day, because it's very hard to eat that much food. Yeah. And there were some things that those soldiers could have done differently that would have minimised that, and I'm sure we'll talk to that, but there's no way they would ever have not been in deficit. And then we see during the next phase, which is their sort of navigation phase, the deficit was a little bit lower, but it was still very high. We're talking maybe about 2,000 calories of deficit per day in the second phase. And then obviously there's the phase of the course where they're being deliberately starved, and we expected a deficit there. But I think it was a bit of a surprise to find that even in those parts of the course where they're not deliberately being starved, that they were actually so far underfed. And of course, because of that and because of the high physical output and the high mental and cognitive and psychological stress of the course, then we saw a whole lot of other changes. So we all know that people lose weight through selection. I don't think that's any secret. And, we've all heard stories of people saying they've lost 10 or 20 kilos, but I was interested to know, well, how much of that is fat mass? How much of that is muscle mass? So that's what the DEXA scans gave us. So we saw on average that they were losing about 7 kilos of body mass total, and that was made up of about 4 kilos of fat and 3 kilos of muscle mass. It's important, I guess, to point out that measurement was taken 2 days after the course finished, and they eat the house down from the moment the course finishes. So there's probably partial recovery has already happened. So on the day they finished the course, their losses would have been a bit higher. And at the same time, we saw really significant changes in hormones. So the one that most men are interested in is to hear what happened to testosterone. And we saw total testosterone decreased by 87%. So huge amounts. Cortisol was also increased, 75% increase. Free testosterone, which is your bioavailable testosterone that your body can use right up, decreased by 93%. So, it's no wonder that people finish something like this or other intense training and don't feel themselves. They're not feeling physically as ready. They're not feeling, their moods are not as good. There's so many impacts from that. Yeah.
So I suppose that's composition and the like and energy. What other things were there? So we talked about, I suppose you're going to get onto sleep and the like, but what other things were, observations and findings from the research?
So we also looked at their physical performance. So I measured strength and power, and we did measure cardiovascular output as well. So what we saw with strength is that post-course, their strength or their peak force was down about 17%, which to be honest was a little bit lower than I expected. I thought there'd be sort of more damage force-wise. Power was down about 30%. We didn't actually measure. We'd done a beep test pre-course. We didn't get a post-course because there's so many soldiers whose feet have really fallen apart by the end, and it was a bit rough to make them then do a beep test. So we never got the post-course on that, but that's, we've got to be human about it. So we saw these changes in physical performance. What was really, I guess, reassuring was that recovery of all of those things I've talked about was quite fast. Post-course, they tend to have a good week of recovery, and in that week they've given education about eating, about sleeping, about, mindset, all kinds of things. And what we saw is that all of the body composition, the hormones, the strength, the power had predominantly recovered between 1 and 3 weeks post-course. Which is pretty remarkable to me, but it's I guess a good reminder of how important and how useful sleep and food are for recovery.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine you're just constantly on edge. So like you can be quite anxious about the whole thing, and it's difficult to get that sleep efficiency. But I suppose who are the best sleepers on the course to really dumb down? Who are the best sleepers on the selection?
So the way we measured sleep throughout the course was pretty crude. They were wearing it's obviously really hard data to collect on a course like that. I wasn't going to be going and, watching anybody sleep, but we put an accelerometer on them. So it looks like a wristwatch, and it was just measuring movement in 3 planes. And that device is estimating sleep based on non-movement, I guess, and consistent non-movement. So what we found from those watches, it spits out how much sleep it thinks someone got, and also how efficient their sleep was. And it's a little unclear as to how it's measuring sleep efficiency, but I'm assuming that it's something to do with how quickly they stopped moving and then how still they were through that period of sleep. And remarkably, what we can see is when we break apart the group into those who made it to the end of selection and those who did not make it to the end of selection, there's actually a difference every day of the course in sleep efficiency. So those who made it to the end of the course, every day of the course, were more sleep efficient, were showing better sleep efficiency compared to those who didn't make it to the end. And on some days that was a significant difference, which to me, for something that's just an accelerometer, to be able to show a significant difference like that is pretty remarkable. My assessment of what does that mean, it's obviously it's not causation from this kind of data. We can only show an association, but my assessment is those who achieved better sleep were more likely to get up and be able to keep going the next day, but also potentially those candidates who were more confident and more organised were more likely to get to sleep more efficiently. You hear of people who are very nervous and not really sure what they're doing, and they're mucking around at the end of the day, and they're repacking their pack, and they're, shoes on, shoes off, whatever they're doing. They're just not getting to sleep well when there's an opportunity to sleep. And we know that sleep deficit is just part of selection. So for those candidates who are confident and organised and know what they're doing and can just go, oh, it's lights out time, let's go, get to sleep and, get the best sleep they can, stay asleep, that's really beneficial for them.
And yeah, because I think to link back to the PTI's episode, Campo spoke about 3 groups. I'm not going to name the 3 groups because it's in the episode, but the first group he mentioned was those that are confident, can predict things happening, and many of those go through selection multiple times. But I suppose are they the guys and girls that are most successful with their sleep?
So I guess we haven't measured that. We don't know, but it makes sense. Yeah. And one of the things that I have looked at over a few years is looking at the effect of previous attempt on selection on the progress through selection in subsequent attempts. So I've looked at, has being on selection before changed the likelihood of finishing selection? And the answer is yes. And this, when I looked at this, it didn't matter what day the person had gotten to on their previous attempt, whether they'd got to day 1 or day 2 or day 3 or day 20. It didn't matter how many attempts they'd had. What I saw is that people who've attempted selection before on every single day of selection were more likely to still be there, on the current selection compared to those who've never attempted selection before. And why is that? And I think there's probably a few reasons. One is, I guess, people who re-attempt selection really want to do it. Every year I think there's people who turn up and attempt selection and they get in a couple of days in and they have that realisation that this is not for me, and those people are probably not in the group that come back and try again. So, we've screened those people out. I think people learn something from their first attempted selection. They learn something about their own preparation, their own behaviours, their own whatever it was that they needed to do better, and they get briefing out by multiple people when they come off selection. So that, there's part of the learning journey. I think also the shock of capture that happens the first time, they've probably overcome that by the time they come back again. So, and they also know what do they need to do differently in their own preparation, whether that was their strength or their cardiovascular fitness or their, pack work carrying. They learn a lot. So yeah, it was to the order of, 2 to 3 times more likely to be finished selection and be selected if it was a subsequent attempt versus first attempt. So, high numbers, yeah.
Coming back to the individual, I suppose that's the observations from the research. Let's go to the usable stuff for people that are going on to selection for the candidates. Obviously, we're going to talk about body fat and some bone density and all that sort of stuff. But more broadly, coming back to the individuals, what are the specific physical attributes that those who finished had over those who didn't finish? Who were the most successful candidates, and what did they do, or how were they? I suppose how were they built is a better question.
It's a really interesting question, and I set out with all this data thinking I'm going to look at this of what does it take to be someone who can finish selection? Do you need to be a certain height or a certain weight or a certain amount of muscle mass or a certain amount of body fat or a certain amount of strength or fitness or whatever? I looked at every bit of data that we had, and I broke it down into those who made it to the end and those who didn't. And the reality is there's no physical attribute that you can put your hat on and say you have to be that. So, the average selection candidate who started selection is 28 years old, 180 centimetres tall, 85 kilos of body mass, and this is over several years. And the average person who finished and the average person who didn't finish are exactly the same. And we have such a range of people who finished. So, of those, over those 2 years worth of DEXA data collection, we have a range of people who finished from 163 centimetres tall to 196. The shortest and the tallest candidates that attempted have made it to the end. We have people as light as 67 kilos who've made it to the end, and they'll be carrying more than their body weight, several times throughout the course. It's incredible. Up to the 108 kilo guy also finished selection. Same thing with their muscle mass and their body fat. I mean, we do. There's quite a bit of chatter about body fat, and people think they need to come into selection with a certain amount of body fat.
Particularly towards the end, that's a couple of myths are that I'm too short to do well on the 20 clicker. I can't do it. And you've just obviously busted that myth to a certain degree. It's still hard.
I think it's hard. Yeah, I think
absolutely.
it's hard for the tall guy and the short guy, but the short people for sure have to work a bit harder on something like the 20 clicker because they have a shorter stride length. So it's definitely hard, and we could go down the discussion of females too and the comparison there, but it's definitely hard, but it's not impossible. It can be done. It's just those people need to train for it.
Yeah. But then, so height, obviously. Let's talk about, I've heard some myths about stacking on a heap of fat, body fat, before attempting selection. There might be a deload week in a training program right beforehand, and therefore it serves as an amazing opportunity to stack on some body fat. And there's a myth out there that will help you throughout selection. I suppose from the horse's mouth, is that myth true?
So, it's a really interesting one that's out there because I've heard that for years and I've observed that for years of people coming into selection who have stacked on this bit of fat right before the course starts because they know they're going to lose weight, so they think, I need to have some weight to lose. And the reality is that people who have stacked on a fat right at the end, their body hasn't had a chance to adapt to carrying that weight, and it's just dead weight. It's the same as putting, some extra weight in their pack that they didn't need to carry. It's not helping them in any way in terms of it's not muscle. It's not creating more force. It's just dead weight. And with my physio hat on, what I saw, multiple times was people coming down for the first time with shin pain, knee pain, plantar fasciitis, and it's because their body is suddenly carrying this extra fat in addition to all the weight they're having to carry on the course. There's that risk, and there's also a risk of failing the 3.2 because they're suddenly carrying dead weight. You've got to carry the weight that they've got to carry on the 3.2 kilometre test plus this extra fat. So my advice is there is no deliberate requirement to stack on fat before selection. What people should be focusing on in their lead up to selection is maintaining weight. They certainly shouldn't be losing weight during their lead up training because they're training hard, to come onto this course. It's important they're eating enough to maintain and build. They're trying to build muscle mass, and that should be the focus. If they're losing weight, they're not eating enough to sustain that training that they're doing, and they're probably not getting the gains out of the training that they deserve to get because they're training hard. Yeah. They shouldn't be losing weight, So the focus should be gain muscle mass, gain muscle mass. Do not be losing weight. Do not be deliberately gaining fat. Because the other part to that is the things people eat to try and deliberately gain fat is not useful. It's not useful. It's not useful nutrition. It's not giving their body what it needs. They should be focused on good quality food that's going to help the training not just sitting eating donuts and ice cream.
Yeah. And I suppose the human performance wing will provide some guides and some research on this, but like for the candidates that are gonna prepare when they submit their EOI. But more broadly, what should people be eating in their preparation for? Like what foods? Obviously, we probably know what foods to avoid, and we talk about not just foods but smoking and alcohol and all that sort of stuff. What should they be doing during their training, particularly up into just before selection, or is that too late?
Just before selection is probably too late. I mean, obviously they should be eating well at that point as well, but right through, when people start their 30-week training program or even prior to that, they need to think about nutrition because, how to get gains out of your training is training, and then it's eating to support the training and it's recovering. So what I think a lot of people don't realise is how much food they need to eat when they suddenly amp up their training. And there's a lot of information out there, unfortunately, in social media that really vilifies carbohydrates. And the reality is, for people who are training hard, carbohydrates is the body's number one source of energy for the muscles and for the brain. So your body wants carbohydrates, it needs carbohydrates. When you're training hard, actually carbohydrates is going to help to maintain muscle mass as well. Protein is absolutely important, but what I found is people generally know to eat protein and they eat enough protein, but they're not eating enough carbohydrate. There's a preparation guide that's available on the 81st SO website that I wrote in conjunction with a sports dietitian for people preparing for selection, and it gives numbers in there of values of how much protein people should be aiming for and how much carbohydrate, so they can go and they can look into that. But yeah, the number one thing is actually more carbohydrate.
That's in the preparation phase and getting ready for and consuming everything you can basically on selection. But you made a super interesting point before we got on the episode about bone density and what leads to high bone density, but also what low bone density results in on selection. Can you just expand on that point?
Yeah, sure. So I actually didn't go into the research thinking I was going to look at bone density, but it became, this is back to the question you asked me right at the start. But because I did these DEXA scans, and DEXA gives you a measure of bone density, I was, as I was transcribing my data from the DEXA scans into my spreadsheet, I, brought across the information about bone density as well. And what I was really amazed to see was that we had a group of candidates on selection who had lower than average bone density for what you would expect for a healthy male, age-matched, healthy male civilian their age. So, I'm not talking about, we weren't comparing against sports people, we were comparing against healthy civilians. So to me, that really sort of tweaked my interest, because I thought, well, why are these people who have been, in the military for a number of years, training for selection, they've gone through all of this heavy training, why are we seeing people who have lower than average bone density compared to a civilian? So that sort of was my first, what is happening? And then when I say lower bone density, I don't mean low bone density. They would not be diagnosable with osteopenia or osteoporosis. It's just lower than average of what you would expect. So I started to watch this group, and amazingly, by the end of selection that year, 1 in 3 of those people who were in that lower than average group had a fracture. And they weren't just stress fractures. It was also rolled my ankle, fractured my leg, rolled my ankle, fractured my heel, had a fall, broke my wrist. They were decent fractures. And nobody who had better than average bone density had a fracture. So suddenly we've got this really obvious delineation and this really good reason why it's good to have good bone density. So then I started to talk to people who, as they came off selection, I'd bring up their DEXAs, I'd explain it to them, and those who were in the lower than average bone density or the really high bone density groups, I had a good chat to go understand what's your training history, what's your diet like, what's your genetic history like, that sort of thing. And I repeated these same conversations when I did the DEXA scans again in 2023. So I had a big data sample, I guess, to understand the difference between people who had low bone density and people who had high bone density. And what we saw was this pretty clear repeatable lessons that those who had the highest bone density or high bone density were generally people who had a history of playing sports, change of direction sports, so basketball, football, rugby, soccer, AFL, martial arts. Those people tended, and they'd been playing that since they were teenagers. or they'd started weight training, gym training, resistance training, I should say, in their teens. Those with lower bone density were often people who had either been couch potatoes throughout their teen years, and then they'd only really started getting active once they entered the military. They'd been swimmers, they'd been cyclists, so, endurance athletes, but in swimming or cycling or something like that, so less impact. There was also a group of people who tended to be lower appetite people. We all know someone like that that's sort of like, oh yeah, I don't really eat breakfast and I'm fine if I skip lunch and I might just have a coffee through the day and then maybe I'll eat a bit of dinner. Those people, because they're just not getting enough energy to support growth of healthy bone. There were some that had been grown up in vegetarian or vegan households and maybe hadn't eaten enough protein perhaps or calcium throughout their sort of growing years. That was kind of the main differentiation. There's obviously a genetic component to bone density as well, which you can't really affect. Yeah, but in terms of diet and training, that's the part we can, really try and optimize, because you don't want to be the person with low bone density who gets a fracture. The other thing that I saw was a good association between muscle mass, the amount of muscle mass, and bone density, because the same things that grow muscle, i.e. resistance training and eating enough, or eating a good amount of total energy, eating enough protein, eating enough carbohydrate, those things are also good for bone health. So, trying to optimize muscle mass is going to be beneficial for bone density too.
Yeah, and So, and then I know the PTIs. So that's the bone density component. Eating enough nutrition. From a flip side, I think the PTIs made the argument that strength is the leading determinant as to whether someone will be successful or not, or how well someone will perform on selection. It is important, but I suppose, is it the most important thing? Noting that we've just talked about a significant number of variables which you had to go out and collect, which is a feat. But is that
I looked at, as in the same way that I looked at, was there a particular height or weight or whatever that differentiated the people who made it or those who didn't. I also did the same with the strength, power, and cardiovascular fitness data to see, did you need to be, was it only people who were, stronger or whatever that made it to the end of the course? And there was nothing there was no difference between those who were successful and those who were unsuccessful in terms of their starting strength, power, cardiovascular fitness. They obviously all needed to be fit enough to pass their SFAT or their SFAP, that it's SFAT now. They needed to be, fit enough to make it on the course. They absolutely needed to be fit enough to pass the 3.2 kilometre run and the 20 kilometre pack march. Those things are a given. You have to be fit enough to pass those. And those two tests require a high level of strength and a high level of cardiovascular fitness. It can't be one or the other. You need both. And, my observation of selection, you need both right throughout. You definitely need to be strong because there's a huge amount of load carriage, and you definitely need to be cardiovascular fit. They need to be able to run.
Yeah, so not just as simple as that. So I think there's just a note here that higher lean mass equals a faster 20 kilometre pack march time, but then lower body fat percentage equals a faster 2.3.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I looked at the association with body composition and performance, and we saw that people who were less fat were faster on the 3.2K run, which makes sense because, like I mentioned before, fat is dead weight. It's not to say try and get skinny, just maintain weight. But more fat was bad for the 3.2K run. More muscle was good for the 20 kilometre pack march. And it makes a lot of sense. You don't want dead weight. You do want muscle mass.
Yeah. The hardest two variables to increase. So that's I suppose when they say we're preparing, what happens with candidates when they're eating on selection? Like, are they? I suppose you talked about not being able to get enough in. There's only, I suppose, one way into the body, and you can only do it. Yeah. So like, how are they leaving stuff? Is it okay to just select stuff in a ration pack or just eat selectively, or is it a game of eating as many calories as you can, just no matter how they come?
Yeah, so this was a really interesting observation for me. Because we were measuring all of the food intake. What that entailed was the sports dietitian and I being in the kitchen, weighing all the food that the cooks were preparing, and all the fresh. We were weighing every bain marie tray. We were counting how many people ate the meal. Dividing by so this much energy and carbohydrate and protein and fat divided by that many candidates is about this much food intake. And when they were eating ration packs, what we had to do then was collect back any uneaten parts of ration packs, anything that was partially eaten or uneaten, and count that out, because we know the total content of a ration pack. So to understand what they ate, we had to count back what they didn't eat, right? And what I was amazed by was how much food was handed back in certain phases of the course. Obviously there was times of the course where everything was eaten. There was other parts where there was some candidates handing back almost full ration packs, and it was things that were left behind was jam and sweetened condensed milk and, all these high energy things, protein things like tuna sachet. Like, I just could not believe that the food was being handed back. And I spoke to some of these, ultimately a lot of those people who were handing back food were off the course pretty soon after that, because as I mentioned, there's a huge energy deficit, even if you're eating everything. So for those who were not eating everything, the deficit would have been even higher, So to understand, I did ask, why weren't you eating that? It was hard to get to in my pack. Oh, we didn't have time. Oh, and I'm not criticizing these people. There's so much stress going on, and there's, there is so much happening during selection. But this is one thing that people need to prioritize, is to try to eat wherever they can. And there's layers to that. There's be organized, think about where you're packing your food in your pack, putting some easier to access things in your webbing or in your pockets, or where you're going to be able to access it on the move, because you might not have time to stop and open your pack and pull the ration pack out and eat it, so they have to be in their preparation for selection thinking about these kinds of things. And maybe it's, take a ration pack when you're going on your pack marching training, and think about where can I put it on my body that's easy to get to. What can I eat and tolerate eating while I'm moving, and practicing those kind of skills so that when it comes to selection, they're ready to go. The other thing that I noticed was when we were counting the food that was left behind, at times we were going into there was a kind of a mess tent that sometimes in the course the candidates were having their breakfast or whatever in there. And I looked around and there was loaves of bread going mouldy, there was boxes of Wheat Bix, there was boxes of sugar sachets, there was cordial, all of this stuff that is like perfect energy food of like high carbohydrate that wasn't being eaten. And it's just, I think, was a evidence of people not really realising, one, that they're in such a deficit, two, that those things are highly valuable, and just not sort of making the most of the opportunities that are around, because there was more food that could have been eaten that wasn't eaten. So yeah, I guess the so what out of all of that is take every opportunity that you can throughout selection to eat, and do not leave things behind. And the other thing that was amazing to me when I asked, why didn't you eat it? Oh, I just don't like that one, or they got sick of, like, we've all been on ration packs and we know how boring it gets, but this is not a time to get bored and not eat. Like, eat anyway, make yourself eat it.
Yeah. The one thing you can control is how much you consume. Yeah,
sometimes, sometimes it's out of their control, for sure. But when it's in your control, eat the food.
So you talked before about the pack marching component as well, but also having, the right things in your pack and all that sort of stuff. Consuming calories while you're moving or pack marching. You have it's called the honey sandwich. It's obviously been made infamous amongst the people preparing for selection. But can you just go through what the honey sandwich is and the importance of carbohydrates?
Yeah. So this of all the stuff that I've done in this PhD, I feel like I'm just getting known for honey sandwiches. So I'll tell the story. So in 2021, the 20-kilometre pack march test happened, and there was quite a high rate of failure of the test that day. So this is one of the gates that people must pass to continue on selection. So it's important that people pass. That year there was about a 45% failure rate. So, it's really high. And the problem is a lot of people who fail that test either, withdraw from the course within like 2 or 3 days following that test. Even if they stay, they get a chance to retest. But I guess in their mind, they're thinking, well, if I failed it already, I'm not going to pass it in 5 more days or whatever, 6 days of more fatigue. I'm just not capable. And they talk themselves out of it and they withdraw from the course. So all of a sudden we've lost candidates who might have been good operators that, they just don't keep going. And so I spent quite a bit of time talking to those candidates as they withdrew following that failure. About why did you, about what happened and, what did you eat for breakfast and why didn't you pass? Because they've all trained for it, right? And there was a lot of them that had collapsed that day as well because their blood sugar was so low. And so when I asked, what did you have for breakfast? The answer kept coming up as, I didn't get breakfast. And I was like, what do you mean you didn't get breakfast? So I went back to the staff and said, why didn't you feed them breakfast? Oh, we did feed them breakfast. And I went back to the candidates. I'm like, they said they fed you breakfast. No, they didn't feed. And anyway, what it came out was that they had eaten at about midnight the night before. But that's after they've done everything else they've done in that 24 hours prior. They'd eaten some food that wasn't even enough when we measured, how much that food was. It would not have been enough to replenish them from what they'd already done that day, let alone prepare them for a 3-hour, 15-minute load carriage test, right? So they weren't sort of, it's kind of like trying to drive your car without putting fuel in at first. So I sort of went to the staff and said, look, that doesn't count as breakfast. Something they ate at midnight last night, that's not preparing them for this test. And, we could do better. And it made a bit of a fuss until eventually they said, fine, and you feed them before the retest. You decide what they're going to eat. And I went, great, But then it was also, I felt a lot of pressure of I've got to get this right because I've made a stand and I've, tried to point out that the food they were fed might have been part of the reason, or they were not fed might have been part of the reason for this high rate of failure. So I thankfully had this sports dietitian from DSTG, Brad Baker, who's an amazing person, with me. And I said to him, look around, what could we feed these candidates for breakfast that's going to give them the best chance of success on the retest? And first he was sort of talking about sports foodie type things. And I said, we can't, it has to be something that's quite basic around here that's going to be acceptable to the staff. And he said, well, a white bread honey sandwich or jam sandwich would be perfect. And maybe some juice boxes because it's easy to digest. It's not going to cause stomach upset. It provides a fast carbohydrates to the working muscles. Let's do this. So I went to the kitchen, supervised the cooks making the honey sandwiches. I got up at 5 a.m. that day, took the sandwiches. I wasn't going to let this fail. So, took the sandwiches to the candidates. There was 10 of them by the time we came to retest time that had hung around. Made sure they ate their sandwiches. Like I stood there, you will eat this sandwich and you will drink this juice box. And
I think the PTIs are the most scary people.
I know, but I was more like the mother hen actually.
Yeah.
But anyway, so made sure they ate their sandwiches, drank their juice boxes. We also gave them a couple of little fruit bars and, I was like, you eat this at one hour in and then you eat this at 2 hours in. Because they didn't have any ration packs at that point. And they flew across the line. I think 7 out of the 10 from memory passed, and they passed convincingly. And the staff that were at the finish line were a bit like, oh, shh. So am I allowed to swear on here? Yeah. Oh, shit. She's not going to shut up about the honey sandwiches. And I was like, it's just science that you feed the body some sugar and it will do better. The muscles have something to use. And so that became a little bit infamous because 2022 came around and they were like, we've got it and we're going to feed them some honey sandwiches. It's fine, And so, 2022 Pack March, there was a 80% pass rate. It was so different. It was so stark, difference due to just a simple breakfast. And so it's not, it's not cheating. It's not anything. It's just like it's simple. We don't feed them stuff that they're going to vomit up because lots of candidates get worried about, I'm not going to eat much before this hard thing because I might vomit. But the reality is that's, high fat, high protein, high fiber things might cause stomach upset, but simple carbohydrates, white bread, honey, jam, whatever, that's all they need to go for before these really hard, intense things. It's become, I've now like 2023, I saw guys, filling their pockets full of honey sachets and things. And I was just so pleased. I was like, yes, you've learned something, or like pulling a soggy, that year it rained a lot. And there was one guy who came out across the finish line pulling this soggy sandwich out of his pocket. And I was like, well, you tried. But it's just.
Did he still consume that?
I think he'd consumed something breakfast, but I don't know what that year was a bit different. It was very rainy. But anyway, the point is, we don't have to have sports gels and, like complicated things. We just go after what is simple, what is high energy that the body can digest really quickly. There's stuff in the ration pack that's also good for that, because some years that's just ration pack. So, and I wrote it into that preparation guide about these are the things in a ration pack that are the lower fiber, higher sugar stuff that you would eat, on the move. You would eat the lollies, you'd eat the that jammy kind of fruit bar thing, like that's really high carbohydrate. It's perfect. It's essentially an energy gel in a little ration pack covered block, So there's just things in there that if the candidate is smart about it and thinks about it and has a bit of preparation and understands what are the things I can eat, that makes a huge difference.
And you talked about the selection preparation guide on the ADF School of Special Operations website. And obviously that has all of this information in there. It goes into great length. But I suppose to come back about pack marching, and we've talked about nutrition, we've talked about sleep, bone density, some of the things that we can and can't control. I suppose, what are your top tips and tricks? We always do this at the end to summarise, but what are your top tips and tricks for candidates that are about to attempt selection and are going through their preparation to succeed on selection?
I guess my top tips would be, with my physio hat on, manage injury early. Because, people pick up niggly injuries throughout their training. Sometimes they think they're too busy to deal with it. But if they come to the start line of selection, nursing an injury, that just gets exposed within the first day or two because the load is so high, you can't carry an injury onto selection. Any kind of injury that begins during training, please go and see your local physio, deal with it early so that, one, you're not going to make it worse, but two, you're also not having to, it's not in the back of your mind that stress about injury. You should just be able to focus on the course.
That's been common across the 3 episodes as well, like injury, like prevent injury or like recognise niggles that become injury and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people who've said to me as they've withdrawn from the course, I just thought I'd give it a go, but like you just can't. It's too unforgiving for that. I guess the next thing is eat. We've talked about it. Eat everything that you can during selection. Whatever's offered, eat it, and think about where you're putting your food so that you can access it. The next one would be eat enough during the training so that you get the most out of what the effort you're putting into training, that your body gets the gains, it gets stronger, gets faster, gets fitter because you're eating enough to support the training. I have a good example of that actually. So,
which I referred to at the start with a candidate being provided a DEXA scan and some advice from you on a first attempt at selection, then subsequently,
Yeah, so this candidate, he was a young guy who came in 2021 and we scanned him. He was really lean, very tall, which is hard for someone who's very tall to be also have a lot of muscle or a lot of fat on them. But yeah, so this particular guy was quite tall and very, very low body fat. And kind of average muscle mass. And he didn't make it super far on the course, but he came back in 2023. So it was a great opportunity for me to scan the same person twice over, 2 years later. And in that time, he'd had the benefit of that preparation guide that we've talked about and the information in there about eating more carbohydrate predominantly. And I asked him when we scanned him the second time, what difference did you make? And he said, I ate a lot more carbohydrate through my training. And when we measured him, he was 6 kilos heavier than the first time we'd measured him. And all of that was muscle mass. He'd put on 6 kilos of muscle in 2 years, which is a huge amount. And what he found, unfortunately, he didn't finish the course again, but his comment to me was that it was so much easier for him to pick up his pack and to carry his pack, which is a huge part of, of selection. So I just think it was fantastic to be able to actually see the results of that advice in action. And, if people can, think about how important nutrition is as part of their training, that's really one of the biggest things you can control. The other advice, I guess, is one question that I get that has come up a lot over the years, right back from when I was involved in selection in 2010, is people wonder, should I be training for selection with no sleep and no food, because they're like, I know that's what's going to happen on selection, so I'll train for that and then my body will be ready for that. And my advice to that is, I think it's important to try that so that you experience that and can feel, what does it feel like to be really tired? What does it feel like to do a pack march on very little sleep, or do a training session on very little food, so that when they experience that again on selection, it's not the first time and it's not unfamiliar. However, I caution against doing a lot of training that way, because they will not be getting any gains out of that training. If people are consistently training without enough sleep and without enough food, they're going to be going backwards, not forwards. So yes, definitely try it, feel it, know that you can cope with it, but don't do a lot of training that way. And I guess the last thing would be, in addition to all of this physical preparation, the mental preparation is also hugely important. And it's, it's not my area of expertise. It's not what my research was about. But what I saw and, what I see every year is that physical preparation is only one part of the story, and it's not the full story, because we can see some of the strongest people that at the start line physically look like they should be able to make it, and they withdraw and request within a couple of days, and maybe their mental preparation wasn't quite where it should be.
Yeah, I think that whole the argument across all three episodes has been the threshold. You need to be fit enough, definitely fit enough, and as strong as as you can be, but as fit enough. But I think then it becomes a mental game. I think you've presented me an awesome segue to the next episode, which is with a psychologist on mental preparation for selection and the common selection. Thank you so much for doing that. I know you were hesitant. It's absolutely awesome to hear about your years and years of PhD research and your access to selection. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.